Hello everyone, my name is Alanzo Paul, and I am a speaker and tutor at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. I cannot express how excited I am to have a very special guest in the studio today. And we're going to be discussing probably one of the most popular questions that we get about the Bible, and one of the most popular questions that we get about God. And it's this, it's after Paul's book here, which I highly recommend, Is God a Vindictive Bully? So today we're going to be thinking about some of the most commonly asked big questions, meaningful questions that we get asked all of the time. And Paul is an expert, as you'll find out in a moment. And we really are just going to pick his brain, and we would love for you just to join in and sit in, pull up a chair, and let's think deeply about this together. So I'm first and foremost with my colleague, Sara.
Hello everyone, my name is Sara Stevenson. I'm also a speaker for the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics. As Alanzo said, we are so excited to have with us today Paul Copan. At the Oxford Centre, we love to explore big, deep questions about Christianity. And so, Paul, if you could introduce yourself to us, because you are an authority and a voice into questions relating to the Old Testament.
I appreciate it. Paul Copan. I teach at Palm Beach Atlantic University in South Florida, and I have written in the area of Old Testament ethical challenges, and so I wrote a book, Is God a Moral Monster? Did God Really Command Genocide? And this one, Is God a Vindictive Bully? Spoiler alert, answered all those questions is no. So look forward to exploring a little bit more with you all in this conversation.
Fantastic.
Paul, I'm gonna kick us off with the very first question, and perhaps at home you've felt this same way as you've read your Bible. It seems like there's a different God in the Old Testament. We see Jesus in the New Testament. He is loving his enemies, he is serving, he is, making bread and fish and gathering prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners to him. But in the Old Testament, it feels like, I don't know, God of war, a God that's, just turning a blind eye to certain things that to us we find morally reprehensible or repulsive. Help us. Are we engaging with two different gods here between the Old and New Testament, or the same God?
We see Jesus revealing who the God of the Old Testament is, and indeed identifying himself with that same God. He shares in the identity of God. We see two tensions or two aspects. We see both the kindness and the severity of God in the Old Testament. And we see it in the New as well, because Paul describes God as both being kind and severe. We see Jesus, who is one who doesn't snuff out a smoldering wick or break a bruised reed, but he's also one who, Revelation 12 tells us, rules the nations with a rod of iron. That he says, come to me who are weary, I will give you rest. There's the gentleness of Jesus. But we also see the wrath of the Lamb, of those who resist God and his purposes, who oppose and dehumanize God's creation. And so those are the types of things that we need to understand, that there is an identity between the God of the Old Testament, the God of the New. In fact, Jesus, we see in Jude 5, for example. Jude 5 says, Jesus, after he delivered the Israelites from Egypt, Old Testament, destroyed those who did not believe. Jesus engages in threatening judgment to his people, the fall of Jerusalem, to a false prophetess, Jezebel and her followers. He says, I will cast Jezebel, Revelation 2, on a bed of sickness, and will strike dead her followers. So there is a severity to Jesus as well. So we see in the Old Testament, God is kind and loving, gracious, compassionate. That's why Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh, because he knew that if the people would repent, that God would show mercy. That's his character. But God will also, when things, when he says that's enough, then judgment will fall. So we see judgment as well as kindness and love in both testaments. And so we just have a lot more territory to cover in the Old Testament. A lot more years go by than just the shortness of the New Testament, but we do see Ananias and Sapphira being struck dead, Herod being struck dead, and so forth. God is still one who opposes sin, opposes those who harm his people, and so forth. We see those sorts of themes coming up over and over again in both testaments.
That's very helpful. That's very helpful. You're saying that we need to God in the Old Testament, God in the New Testament, one being. Problem is that conceptually, sometimes we're just hyper-focusing in on Jesus, God of the New Testament, and just the loving component without some of the really difficult things that he says, the balancing that goodness and severity. And in the same time, in the Old Testament, we might hyper-focus on the severity bit, but we're missing a lot of the goodness bit, Hosea and Jonah and so on and so forth. So you're advocating this harmony in this sort of way, coloring in more of the character on both sides and seeing that this is indeed one God. That's very helpful.
Yeah, we see God stepping in, renewing his covenant with the people who have broken it and gone after other gods. We see him constantly sending the prophets to warn them and so forth, and to turn to God that he might show them. He says, I set before you life and death. Choose life that you may live. God wants his people to do well. He wants his people to receive his blessing. He doesn't want to send them into exile and so forth. So God is often pleading with his people, renewing this covenant, warning them so that they'll return to him.
That's great. That's so helpful. Go ahead.
Yeah, that is really helpful. And I think that you're picking up on a point that Paul has made, that there is a consistent character of God in the Old and New Testaments. But I think maybe skeptics, atheists, critics of Christianity might be picking up a thread that, are we not just widening the problem then, so that this God is actually vengeful in both the Old and the New Testament? No. Is this actually strengthening the case against Christianity with this defense?
Yeah. Well, God is one who will hold us all accountable for what we've done, that God is a God of justice, that God is not going to let justice sleep, that God is willing to show mercy, desires to show mercy, is not willing that any should perish, but that all come to repentance, Old Testament as well as New Testament. And so we see that, if we're talking about, yes, we're widening it, maybe God is, severe in the New Testament as well. Well, I think that it's important to understand that God is both just and loving. God is light and he is love, as 1 John tells us. But we also see that God's wrath emerges when people are dehumanized, when people are brutalized, when people are oppressed. God stands up for the marginalized. God stands up for those who cannot defend themselves. And so I think of Miroslav Volf, who had lived in the former Yugoslavia, where he talked about his people getting shelled day in and day out, people brutalized beyond imagination. And he used to think, I don't like a God who gets angry. And he said it was through that experience of war and the brutalization that came from that. He said, I couldn't believe in a God who doesn't get angry. He said, God isn't angry in spite of his love. He is angry because he is love. And so that is something that we ought to see, that God is, when you look at even God's jealousy, the term can be translated, the word is zeal in the New Testament, that God is zealous for his purposes. God is zealous for people who are being oppressed, that God is not going to simply let injustice continue. God is going to address it at some point or other, and sometimes it falls in this temporal world.
Yeah, we do deeply care about justice, and it's helpful for you to point that out to us. But I still think that there is this theme being explored in culture whereby God is seen as this vengeful being. I recently was watching a film, a Marvel movie, Guardians of the Galaxy 3, whereby there's a character in that movie who is trying to alter a particular species, but in the process is going to flood the rest of the world. And there seemed to be this undertone that was comparative of the actual God, who we have stories in the Old Testament that God actually flooded the world. So is culture picking up a genuine thread that his anger is out of proportion, let's say, to human anger, to the point where he would actually flood the world?
Well, when we come to the flood, it's not as though God is being capricious here. A lot of people think that God is just arbitrary and just lashing out, that he's kind of hitting the smite key on his computer to bring an end to this or that person. No, oftentimes God is acting precisely in light of the warnings that he has given. We see with the flood of Noah, however we would understand that as a regional flood or a global one, or however we would understand that story. A lot of people are mystified about it, but it does have important theological themes. And one of those themes is that Noah is one who is warning people about this flood, and we see that commented on later in the New Testament, that there is warning, that there is judgment that is coming. We also see that God is acting because the world has become violent. it has become violent, and God is grieved at this. So it touches God's heart. God is moved by this terrible scenario that people are harming one another, fellow image bearers. And it gets to the point where human beings have descended to such a depth that God is going to say, I'm just going to finish everything off. I'm going to finish off what human beings have started. It's not as though God delights in it. He's grieved to do this. So we need to understand those verbs relating to God and his heart. So God does that. He acts with regard to the just kind of having to start over. And so we see the language of a new creation with regard to after the flood comes, there is an institution of being fruitful and multiplying and human beings being made in the image of God. And so there's this new creation emerging, as it were, from that flood that God desires to bring newness rather than just saying, I'm done, forget it. No, God desires to continue and persist with humanity. We also see that God is one who institutes capital punishment to prevent that kind of violence from going on. So Genesis 9:6 talks about how if someone murders a fellow image bearer, a divine image bearer, then that person's blood should be shed. So there are a number of things that are being done here to address that. God is He's beginning something new. God is going to continue with humanity. We see, in a sense, the hope in God's heart for humanity that God has not done because God is going to fulfill His promises that flood is not the last word.
It's very helpful, Paul. But I have another question that I think is probably one of the number one Old Testament questions that I get asked. And it's going to be, what kind of God would test one of his followers in the way that he tests Abraham in asking him to bring his son up a mountain and sacrificing him? It just seems so beyond okay. How should we understand this?
Yeah. I'm reminded of, sometimes you'll see in a movie where there's this critical scene and there are these two friends talking. There's maybe some danger and one person says to the other, do you trust me? And the person says, yes, I do. There's a history there. And then that person, does what that other person says, who's, I trust you, and it all comes out well. That person made the right judgment. That person who trusted him, it came out in the end. And that's exactly what we see with regard to Abraham and Isaac. God has been a friend of Abraham's over these decades. It's not as though this happened one night and then the next morning Abraham goes and takes his son Isaac out for a sacrifice. There's been a history. There's been a promise that God makes with Abraham that through your offspring, namely Isaac, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. And so here, and then this child comes. Abraham tries it his way with Hagar, and then Ishmael comes from this union. But God says, no, it's going to be from you and your old wife, Sara, through whom this child is going to come. So there's this miracle child that has come. God promises that there will be a blessing to all the families of the earth. And we even see in chapter 21 of Genesis, just before we get to the sacrifice of Isaac, that God tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away because of the tension in the household. And to send them away meant a great threat, a great danger to send them in the wilderness. But God says, I'm going to make of Ishmael a great nation. Trust me. We are friends. Trust me.
Yeah.
Next chapter, he's saying, please take your son. There's a tenderness to God's command. Take your son whom you love, your only son, and offer him up. And again, this is something that comes from a friend, not from some kind of dream in the night from kind of a strange source. There has been a pattern here. There's been a friendship. There's been a promise. There's been a miracle. And so when Abraham is going to offer up Isaac, he tells his servants, we will go and worship, and we will return. He's confident that God is going to bring Isaac back, doesn't know how it's going to happen, whether it's through some preemptive action or through raising him from the dead. That's what Hebrews says. Abraham reckoned that God is even able to raise the dead. I mean, he produced this child, for Abraham and Sarah. How much more could he not raise him from the dead if need be? But God was determined to keep his promise. He even laid it all on the line in chapter 15, where he made a promise to Abraham, and he has this animal cut up into pieces, Abraham does. And then we see God walking, as it were, as a fire, this flaming fire,
Love it.
moving through these pieces, basically making a covenant with Abraham, saying, let it be done to me as it was done to this animals if I violate my word against you. That is powerful. There is a promise. There is confidence.
Thank you, Paul.
That's very helpful. Was I the only one that was thinking Aladdin when he said, do you trust me? From the balcony, Jasmine? No,
I was just
that
doing-
could just be me. Anyway, so that's very helpful.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm conscious of the fact that some of our listeners might be parents. And when they put themselves into the shoes of a parent that's going to lift a knife to their child, it seems difficult to defend that even if God does not end up taking the life of their child, that there's some form of psychological manipulation to parents whose natural instinct would be to protect their children. So it's that side of it. How can parents be reassured that God is actually trustworthy?
Yeah. Well, as I said before, there is the binding of God to Abraham in this covenant that he has made, that God is going to fulfill his promise, that there has been a decades-long friendship with Abraham, that God produces this miracle with Abraham and Sarah, that there is this steady movement forward, that God is doing something very special, very unique, singling out Abraham, which is far different from your ordinary parent here wondering about this. This is something that is unique in salvation history. There's been a lot of precedent and conversation, promise, and trust in God that God had proven himself faithful all along. So it's not as though this is somehow that this is something that could be expected of us to do. I mean, there is some sort of surrender in which we entrust the well-being of our children to God. We, as it were, surrender them and give them over to God, that we can't control them, that we can't guarantee a certain outcome as to how they'll turn out and so on. So we offer them up to God in that way. But we also do see that God is willing to actually go to the limit with his own Son. The language is taken from Genesis 22, that you have not withheld your one and only Son. That God, in Romans chapter 8, does not withhold his one and only Son from us. In fact, gives him up for us as our substitute. And of course, some people say this is cosmic child abuse. No, Jesus lays down his life. John 10 tells us, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down, Jesus says, and take it up again. Jesus voluntarily does this for the sake of rescuing humanity. So there's a wonderful picture that God himself is willing to give of his own Son, this substitute for our sakes, that this is something that is a great grief, a great, kind of a moment of anguish in the Godhead, as it were. But God is willing to do these sorts of things in order to turn his own enemies into friends. That while we're enemies, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly, and that if he's willing to give his own Son for us while we're enemies, how much more will we be saved by his life? Romans 5 tells us. So there is this marvelous picture of God actually carrying this out himself, that God is doing this very thing that he is commanding Abraham to do, but instead of saving the life, rescuing the life, God is one who allows his Son to lay down his life for our sakes.
That's really helpful. So it's not a normal or a normative thing for a parent to be asked to sacrifice their children. We know that that is condemned by God. Something unique is going on here, and it's also that pre-New Testament picture as well. That's so helpful.
Yeah.
I just want to take this in a bit of a different direction, and that is some women's concerns around the God of the Old Testament is just a consistent picture whereby women seem to lack rights, they seem to lack God's defense. At times they seem to be property to men. They certainly do not seem to be of equal value to men in the Old Testament. So I appreciate that that's a massive theme in and of itself, and we're bringing lots of objections to you today, Paul.
Yeah.
But even if you could just give some insights as to the value of women in the Old Testament would be helpful.
Sure. Well, when we look at the beginning, we see in Genesis 1 the vision, the biblical vision And whatever we see in maybe various laws, remember Jesus said that Moses permitted certain things because of the hardness of human hearts, not because they're the ideal. Well, where do we see the ideal? We see it in Genesis 1 and 2, where there is a fundamental equality between male and female. God makes human beings in his image, male and female, and that, of course, marriage is the ideal. One man, one woman is one flesh for one lifetime in Genesis 2:24. And Jesus affirms that in the New Testament in Matthew chapter 19. So we see this fundamental ideal, and we also see, even in something like the Ten Commandments, where some people say, "Oh, look at the 10th commandment: you shall not covet your neighbor's, his donkey or his house or his wife. Oh, she's just like a piece of property." Well, just read a few verses further. Honor your father and mother, not honor your father and a piece of furniture. Not honor your father and property. And we read in Proverbs, the wise son is one who listens to both his father and his mother. We see that one Old Testament scholar by the name of Carol Myers, she says that we have in the Old Testament not, she thinks it's an unhelpful term, in fact, an anachronistic term, where we have, to use the term patriarchy. To call it patriarchy, she said, is laden with all sorts of modern, kind of Marxist, themes and so forth. And she said it's actually unhelpful. She said that what we have in the Old Testament is heterarchy, where women have power in certain areas, they have authority, professionalism, and so forth, and men have their own areas of authority and expertise and so forth, and that you see both of them working together. We see women who rise up in leadership, people like Deborah. She rises up as a ruler in the land of Israel. She is one who is trusted. She is one who is authoritative. We see, even in the day of Elisha, where we have this Shunammite woman who is, she is eventually deprived of her property. She goes to the king, and after squatters have taken over, she goes to the king, and then takes back her property because the king has granted it. So she's considered a great woman in this area. And so she has authority, she has clout, she is trusted. And so, even in Proverbs 31, we have the woman who is who is married, her husband trusts her and so forth, but she is an entrepreneur. She is someone who is a real estate person. She assesses a field and buys it. She's engaged in commerce and so forth. So someone who is doing amazing stuff, outside the home, as well as taking care of her family very lovingly within the home. And so we see that there are a lot of these pictures of this marvelous, equal representation. Now, of course, God is concerned about women because typically in the ancient Near East, they did not have fair representation. But sometimes, like in the book of Numbers, when the daughters of Zelophehad say, "Hey, we don't want our inheritance after our fathers died to go to Uncle so-and-so. Why can't we have the inheritance?" God says to Moses, "They're right. Let them have their inheritance." So he is countering some of these assumptions that are common within the ancient Near Eastern structure, and sees that there is a fundamental equality that is here. And God holds, even when it comes to penalties regarding adultery, God doesn't let the men get off the hook. Both men and women are responsible parties, that they are to be treated equally before the law. But God is also concerned that when a husband dies, that the woman is in a much more vulnerable position. So that's why we see that triad over and over again. God is concerned about the orphan, the widow, and the alien. And we see that God is looking out for them, and God makes laws not to take advantage of those who can be most easily taken advantage of. So God is looking out for those who can be most easily taken advantage of, and that includes the women. So if they're at a disadvantage, God is saying, you are not to take advantage of that person who is in this vulnerable situation, whether it be a young person or a man or a woman. You are to look out for those who are in need of help, because you too were once aliens. You were once estranged in the land of Egypt, and so God is reminding them of their own vulnerable and oppressive situation, not to carry that over into the land of Israel.
So, Paul, we're going to wrap it up, as someone once said. Numbers 31, this is one that's deeply troubling, at least the superficial sort of reading and understanding of it. In Numbers 31, for those that might not be, maybe haven't read that in a while, it seems to be that Israel is permitted to take women as spoils of war. And I just can't understand how God would allow such a thing. So help us understand what's going on in context.
Yeah. Well, there are a few things to consider with regard to this passage, and there are other issues that relate to it, and I'll just be very brief here. One is that the Lord commands Moses to fight against the Midianites, and so Moses does indeed, give this order. The Israelites fight against the Midianites, and the Midianites are defeated. And I go into issues related to hyperbole and warfare and so forth. I spend a lot of time on that in my books, but especially in this one. I devote a lot of time to this passage in Numbers chapter 31. But some people think, oh, this is permitting maybe war rape. And I have a chapter on war rape in my book, but which was again forbidden. Sexual relations outside of marriage were prohibited, and we even see that those who are going into war, like Uriah or David's men, before they're to receive the sacred bread in Nob, the high priest asks, "Have your men had sexual relations with women?" And David says no. Okay, then they can have this bread. So that's been so that's a little bit of an insight. Uriah, when he's at the front of the battle, David brings him back home to kind of cover up his wrongdoing and wants Uriah to sleep with his wife, Bathsheba. He says, he sleeps outside the palace. He doesn't want to go to his wife while his brothers are out on the battlefield fighting and so forth. So forget, rape after battle, which was common in the other parts of the ancient Near East, but not even before or during. You just don't participate in this sort of a thing. That's just something that is a kind of a sacred charge in Israel. So when it comes to these women, some people say, oh, they're just kind of seen as maybe property or something like that. Well, keep in mind what I think Deuteronomy 21 offers I think an important window here. For one thing, women who were prisoners of war, who were remaining in the land after their our husbands fighting in battle had been defeated, there weren't any options. Pretty much destitution, poverty, and so forth. It was a way of incorporating women into Israel in a humane way, back in that sort of a setting, and for the women to be incorporated into Israel, there had to be a parting ceremony, as Deuteronomy 21 says, where the woman clips her nails, shaves her hair, puts on clothes of mourning. And she also then, there's a waiting of a month, and only then can he take this man who's interested, take her as a wife. So no sexual relations or anything like that, but is taken as a wife in a very, I think, official way that honors this woman. And if he decides not to marry her, maybe has second thoughts, the command is not to humiliate her, not to treat her with disdain and so forth, that there is a special regard, even for this foreign woman, not to treat her as property or something like that. So you do see that there is a kind of a reinforcing text that brings a little bit more perspective on that passage in Numbers 31.
That's really helpful. So suppose I'm one of the women that's, after a battle, Israel just defeated my nation, and I'm imagining if I'm in her shoes, I'm scared. I don't have support. I don't have livelihood. I don't have defense. I don't know how I'm going to put bread on the table. Maybe I have a few kids. And what you're saying is there's going to be a ceremony. So there's some dignity already given to the women.
Right.
And there's going to be a ceremony. I get time to mourn, because that's obviously been a very traumatic season. And then there will be men who will have will select me in some sense.
Or a particular man who is interested in this.
Interested.
And so that precedes it. The person is interested, and then there is this ceremony. So that precedes it. So
okay.
Yeah,
no, that's just, I'm trying to get my head in, like, what would it be like for some of these women? Because I think we read that and we just think, oh my gosh, like, throw her in the back of my truck, or like throw her in, the house or whatever. But this dignity that Israel is having towards women, and this sacred view of sexuality, that they're just is part of who they are, as well as their religion. that reframes it in a much better way. That it really helps me to understand. And
I also, remember that 36 times in the Law of Moses, God reminds the people of Israel, "You were once slaves in the land of Egypt." So he's reminding them of their history, how they were vulnerable, how they were easily oppressed, and so that's why he is telling them to look out for the widow, the orphan, and the alien, and that would be the woman who is taken in. So, in fact, you are to love, Leviticus 19, you are to love the alien
yes,
as yourself. You're to show kindness to this. And there's a curse on those. At the end of Leviticus, a curse on those who show disdain for the alien. That there is to be a regard for the alien, and that you see the tenderness of God here, who, like I said, is looking out for the vulnerable. He is looking out for those who can't care for themselves. So there are these special concerns that are being addressed by the Law of Moses. We don't see all of the picture here, but that is the fundamental heartbeat of the Law of Moses.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but even the alien is to be treated as an equal under the law as
Exactly.
well.
Yeah. Both the citizen, the Israelite, and the stranger were to have the same law. They're to operate on the same basis. Yep.
That's very helpful.
I love the idea of actually putting ourselves into the shoes of these people in these stories.
Yeah.
And I think maybe underlying all of these questions, Paul, is if we were to flip this into the positive, is God good? Is he trustworthy?
Sure.
What would you finally want to say about that?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that we see over and over again is that God is looking out for those who often can't look out for themselves, those who have power, to use that power to bring, to lift up those who are fallen, to lift up those who are needy, and to keep people, and also to exert that power. Like if you've got land and you're growing crops, don't pluck everything from the tree or cut everything from your fields. Leave some for those who are impoverished, perhaps who have been hit harder than you have by difficult economic times. Allow them to come into your field and to cut grain, to pluck fruit that remains, in order to care for them, to keep them from falling further into poverty. So there are also preemptive measures that are being taken, and that you can't keep servants longer than an indentured servant longer than 6 years. You're not to hang on to them and misuse your power. You're to let them go and to load them up with provisions and so on. So there's that generosity of heart that is there. And again, that reflects not only that human beings are made in the image of God, but also Israel's own experience in Egypt, that is to inform how they're there to treat the needy in their land.
God cares and loves for everybody.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Indeed.
Yeah. Well, Paul, thank you so much for coming and spending this time and allowing us to pick your brain on these topics that really, really matter. And thank you, everyone, for pulling up a chair and watching alongside us and listening. We're so grateful that you're tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics, we just want to thank you. And thank you, Paul, again for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
We'll see you next time.